Hello and welcome back to the Dignity of Work. This is Doug Foresta, and this episode is part of our inclusion series. If you want to learn more about the inclusion series and why we're doing it, stick around to the very end and you'll hear a conversation between Cami Eakins and myself about the inclusion series. So thanks so much, and now on to the episode.
Welcome to the Dignity of Work. Embark with us on a journey that helps today's workforce better their quality of life. Brought to you by Career Path Services. Here's your host, Doug Foresta.
Hello and welcome back to the program. This is Doug Foresta, and very excited to have with me. This is part of our continuing our inclusion series. And with me today is Sarah Lloyd, and she is a principal disruptor at Soul on Fire Consulting. And we're going to learn what that is. Sarah, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me, Doug.
Thank you. So, first of all, tell us about your consulting business. What is Soul on Fire Consulting? And tell us a little bit about how you came to this work.
Yeah, absolutely. So Soul on Fire Consulting actually has two different arms of work. One is radical change coaching for individuals who want to infuse change into their lives in a variety of ways. And then the other is organizational consulting and working with organizations specifically to operationalize what it looks like to do equity work and to have equity actually put at the center of the work. It came about because I was between jobs and I was negotiating a contract with a new nonprofit. I've come from higher education and nonprofit work and crisis support and things like that, and youth development. And I had a moment where I thought to myself, like, if ever there was a time to make the leap, now is the time. And I've been blessed with a lot of different experiences across the country, doing a lot of different kinds of work and working with a lot of different leaders, both seeing like what really works well and then things that fail miserably, and figuring out how do I utilize all of that experience as the gift that it is to help other leaders lead even better. And so it continues to evolve, but really looking at different than the standard like diversity, equity, and inclusion work where we're talking about lenses and things like that. It's really about how do you put equity for all people in the center of the work. And so it's been an incredible experience so far over the last year and a half so far.
Well, thank you. And yeah, I'm gonna ask you in a little bit about what that means. But before we do that, and we're talking about equity today, could you define equity for our listeners? How does equity differ from equality, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of times when I have this conversation, people bring up that picture with the like three people at the baseball game and the boxes and things. And it's inherently problematic, but we don't have to get into that today. I think the simplest, most boiled down example is, let's say you and your entire family, okay, are like, hey, Sarah, we really need some shoes. And so I'm like, cool, I got you. So I go out to the store and I come back with like 5 sets of Nike men's size 10 orange shoes. Okay. Now, someone in your family might be like, dope, my dreams just came true. But most likely there will be things, either the color or the size or the style, that doesn't work for people. But me giving every single member of your family a size 10 men's bright orange Nike shoe is equality. It's giving everybody the same exact thing. Equity looks like you saying, hey, Sarah, me and my family need shoes. And I'm like, perfect. Write down what you all need, and then I'll go get them for you and bring them back. So some of you might want flip-flops. Some of you might want water shoes. Some of you might want the bright orange Nike 10s. But you're going to get your specific need met. And that part is equity. So it's our ability to engage in a system that meets our specific needs consistently over time, regardless of the demographics we connect with inside of our identities.
Thank you. That's a really good explanation. And then you had mentioned a little bit earlier about this idea of centering equity in an organization versus like we hear about, using a DEI lens. So explain what that means. What does it mean to center equity versus using a lens?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the problem inherently with having an equity lens is just like glasses, you can take them off, right? So, I don't know how many listeners wear glasses, but like in the winter, for instance, no matter where you're at, like glasses are great until you switch from like outside to inside, and then they get all fogged up, and then you're like, ugh, and then you just take them off, right? Well, lenses can come off when you have equity in the center of the work that you're doing. What it means is that as I engage in decision making, I'm holding myself accountable at all times to have my solutions come from equity. Because when I sit there and ask myself, for instance, a framework I regularly use with clients is the 5 whys, right? So, why are we doing this? And you get an answer, and then you ask yourself why 5 times. And when you get to the core of the why, if it's not equity, then inherently your solutions are rooted in someone having access and someone else not. And that's problematic. And so equity lens does not require you to really ask some hard questions about the why of the work you're doing, but putting equity at the center creates the necessity and accountability to have the equitable access for resource and meeting needs at the center of what you're doing. And so there's real self-check, there's real accountability, and there's real inclusion in real ways when equity is at that center.
Can you say a little bit more about what does that look like? What does an organization that centers equity look like? Give us if you could give us an example, I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for instance, if an organization is centering equity, they may not have the diverse workforce yet that they would like, that many of us confuse with an equitable workforce. So, for instance, a lot of times organizations engage in this work, and the first thing they say is like, how do we get more diverse applicants to come, like apply to work here and then come work for us? And it's bigger than that. So, for instance, you may look at a policy and say, when we look at this policy, who is being included and who is being excluded? Who is being supported inherently, and is anyone left out? And when you're asking those questions about your policies and procedures, then what happens is you start preparing ahead of time for the diverse workforce that you would love to have. So it's kind of like you're going to have family over. You aren't just like, oh, well, laundry's everywhere, dishes are in the sink. You prepare for the company that you're planning to have, right? It's the same with organizations. And so really it looks like, for instance, in a hiring policy, if the questions you're asking are either directly exclusive or inherently exclusive, then you need to change those questions because you're not drawing the most diverse applicants, because your questions are asking things that send the message that we only want certain people here. The requirements for the job. The most simple one is whether or not organizations require degrees to be successful. And there's so much wrapped into that I could talk about for like 100 hours. But what it looks like is saying, do we actually need a bachelor's degree to do this job? Or do we need a certain set of skills that sometimes is found in a bachelor's degree and also is found in a lot of different other contexts? And how do we expand our structure so that inherently, I don't have to say I would love for Black applicants to come. It's inherent in the messaging I'm sending and the questions I'm asking that Black experience inside of the US or inside of Washington is a part of what I've thought about. So it's the difference between me inviting you to a party I'm already having and me really making sure you're thought about in the design of the party to begin with.
I love that differentiation. So maybe that is one of the misconceptions, but talk about some of the misconceptions that you see that organizations have about equity. Like if they say to you, hey, we're doing this, or this is too hard, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think there are two main huge ones. One is that representation is important, and it's the limitations of population. For instance, I've had many conversations with organizations, or especially with boards, that like if their board or their staff or their clients represent, let's say 13% of the population where you live is African American or Black. So if they have 13% board members, if they have 13% staff, if they have 13% clients, then they are doing enough with equity, and that's a reflection of their effort. When in reality, inherently diversity should exist naturally. And if you're in a context like, say, sexual assault and domestic violence, and you have a situation that's disproportionately affecting Black and African American individuals, then in theory, you should have a much greater number in what you're serving and than in your staff and board, right? So maybe it's 50% of clients who experience sexual assault, let's say, are Black. Then your board, your staff, and your client base should reflect the actual impact, not the population. I think the other thing is that you can do enough. Like, I think a lot of organizations are doing nothing. And so they're making progress by saying, let's do a 1 hour training once a year. Like, we already have a staff retreat. We can squeeze in 30 minutes. We can squeeze in an hour. We can squeeze in a half day to do like really deep searching, personal and intimate work. And so I think ever thinking you can do enough or not right sizing the resource dedicated to doing the work can perpetuate more harm than it's ever doing help.
Sarah, how would an organization know? How do I know if I'm a leader, if I'm being successful in centering equity? How do I measure that? How do I know that?
So I think two things. One, I would say when you utilize the framework of the 5 whys and you make any decisions, more times than not, when you get to the core why of the decision you've made or why the policy exists or why you hired this person over that person, equity or something related to equity is found at the center. An example would be like most organizations do a salary survey, and at one point, either annually or every couple of years, they make sure throughout the industry, people who are doing similar work are being paid similarly. What it could look like is inside of our organization, there might not be parity when people are being paid differently, right? Like I might make a different rate than you make when we work in the same office and do the same work. And when we ask ourselves why and get to the core of it, if equity is the justification for disparity, then that is a sign that you're centering equity. But if we're like, okay, well, Doug has more experience, that's why he gets paid more than Sarah. Experience is code for the ability to access resource and opportunity. So it's really having honest questions and conversations about what's motivating the shifts and changes that we have and what motivates what exists currently. I think the other thing, and it's the hardest thing, is to really center the voices of people who are historically and current day impacted by systemic imbalance. And when they're telling you, like, I feel unsafe, then you still have work to do. And when they're telling you, I would recommend to my friends of color, to my LGBTQ plus, to my, neurodiverse friends, like I would recommend that they come work here because I know they'd be safe, then I think you're getting closer.
This is fantastic. So thank you so much for sharing this. I'm trying to think about, again, as a leader, I'm listening to this and I'm thinking, you know what? I do need to do more, or I need to do something. Right?
Yeah.
A lot of times it's something, not just more.
Absolutely.
So I have a 2-part question for you. What would be the first steps for an organization if I want to start to center equity? And then number 2 is, what's the bare bones amount that you need in terms of buy-in to get started on this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first step is to really have an honest assessment, whether you like contract with a consultant like myself, and there's a lot of colleagues that I have across the country that are doing really great work. And it's important to do your homework about that, right? But to contract with someone who can come in and do an assessment of like how ready your organization and leadership team and staff members are to do the work, I think that's part of it. I think also, though, something I encounter regularly is this tension that people have around like, we want to do really good work and we want to do it now. Also, we don't currently have the resource to do that. And so a good friend of mine, Mo Young, always says, your budget is a moral document. And so I think prioritizing resource to figure out and create margin and create space and create resource around examining what are the things that people are saying most about our organization. Why, the last 20 people that left, what did they say? And were there themes and patterns? Our brains naturally function to find patterns, so it wouldn't be challenging necessarily. But then also, I think looking at policies and procedures and saying, most organizations have more policies than they do people. And so it's like, what are we saying? And if we understand fundamentally that everything speaks, then there's some real accountability to saying, like, what are we telling people without speaking, that it means to work in this environment and what we value. And I think when you start to ask those questions, that's the first part, right? With any kind of change you want to make, the first step is like getting really aware of where you're actually standing. And to be able to stand in that uncomfort and do that diligently is important. I think the bare bones of what you need for buy-in in an organization is either one of two things. I think it's one, an understanding that we don't have to create dramatic, radical, and traumatic harm in order to shift and change. And that if you ask most people how they feel about change, they're terrified of it, hate it, it's hard, etc. And if you ask them, if I told you today, I've seen the future, I've seen you 5 years from now, and you're exactly the same, how would you feel about that? Most people would be drastically disappointed. Thus, we're not afraid of change. What we're afraid of is change we're not in control of. And so I think just right sizing our understanding about what it means to change and what the necessity is. And then understanding that, like, there are two ways to do this, optionally or mandatorily. I think, a lot of organizations step up to equity work because they are in the throes of legal action or other really harmful, maybe they blew up in the media, whatever, but now they're doing damage control. And then there are organizations who are really trying to do it earnestly, understanding they have created harm. They may not have heard about it, but they don't need to because it's necessary, because we fundamentally at our best selves function in a space where we're worried about the greater good, right? It's Maslow's hierarchy of needs and all those things. So if we function as individuals and as groups of people who understand the greater good is our core responsibility, then the stewardship and the understanding of that stewardship comes at a higher priority. And so I think it's really just having an organization that understands they may not know fully or fully grasp or fully agree with the impact that's possible, and the impact is happening either way. And so they want to be accountable to that impact. And whenever there's an organization that has that, they can ride the difficulty of doing equity work because they know fundamentally it's not about them, it's about the greater good.
Sarah, you have shared such great information.
People you.
I know someone's going to list this and say, oh my gosh, I need to talk to Sarah. I need to learn more about Soul and Fire Consulting. What's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, so I'm on all social media, so Facebook, Instagram, etc. At the Soul on or the Sarah Lloyd, and then also my website is soulradical.com. So you can find me at soulradical.com or on social media with at the Sarah Lloyd.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your words of wisdom.
Thank you.
Hello and welcome back to The Dignity of Work. It is always a pleasure to be here with Cami Eakins, the CEO of Career Path Services. And today we're going to talk about our inclusion series. Cami, welcome.
Thanks. Nice to see you, Doug.
Thank you. So can you explain for our Dignity of Work listeners, why did you decide to do this inclusion series?
Well, I felt like it was really important for us to get a conversation started about who do we include in workforce development programs and who might be excluded. And one of the ways that I thought we would be able to broach that subject is to talk about specific needs of specific subgroups of people we might serve.
So, Cami, what would you say to workforce professionals or any leaders out there who say, why do we need to be so mindful of this inclusion thing? I mean, we treat everyone with respect. We treat everyone the same. Why do we need to be thinking about this so much?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great point. And I really think it boils down to this. We may not know what we don't know. We need to really do a deep dive and be asking ourselves, who is being excluded from services for whatever reason? And are there others that we may need to reach and invite in to be part of the system? And that's what this inclusion series is really about. It's to get us just thinking and having a conversation around who is receiving great services and great opportunity to meaningful employment at the end of the day, and who might be left behind. And then what do we do about it?
And I just want to add there that obviously, Cami, if we were to dig into every diversity dimension that exists, our podcast series would be at least 1,000 podcasts long. So, we're not saying that this is the end of the conversation or this is everything you need to know about every diversity dimension. But rather, it's a starting point of the conversation.
Exactly. We need to start somewhere. And I think that every time when you're talking about inclusion, as soon as one group is included, there may be the danger that someone else is being excluded. So this has to be an ongoing conversation where we're talking about how do we bring people in, how do we welcome, how do we create a belonging environment.
Well, I'm very excited that we are starting this conversation today, and I hope everyone enjoys this inclusion series.
Me too, and would love to hear feedback and ideas from folks.
Thanks for listening to an episode of The Dignity of Work. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And please share our episode with your network.